Hey, everybody, welcome back to Reason and Theology. Your host, Michael Lofton, joined by Dr. David Wood and Dr. Khalil Andani, who are going to be giving some of their post debate review thoughts and answering some questions related to a debate that they just recently had about 2 weeks ago on Capturing Christianity with Cameron Bertuzzi's channel on the question of the crucifixion and whether or not the Quran teaches that Jesus actually died in the crucifixion or if there's another explanation there. So they had a fascinating discussion about that debate. If you haven't seen it, go to the show notes, click on the link there and go and watch it out. I watched it twice. It was so fascinating and interesting. And I appreciated both of you gentlemen in the way you conducted yourselves and presented your own side. And it seems like there was a great deal of agreement, and perhaps we'll discuss that here in a moment. But let's first greet everyone individually. Dr. Wood, welcome to the show. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Great. And Dr. Andani, great to have you back on. How are you?
I'm good, and it's always nice to visit you guys here. So
Absolutely. Lewis, good to see you again. How you been?
Oh, been life's been a little bit busy. Had a lot of stuff that I needed to do in the past little while, but always happy to take some time to do these shows. Especially, I believe this is my first time actually sharing the floor with Dr. Wood, so it is a honor and a pleasure.
Yeah, and you have a few questions lined up. You can go ahead and maybe ask some of those and also give your thoughts on it. And I also want to get Dr. Wood's overall impression, Dr. Andani. Actually, perhaps let's start there. It seemed like most of y'all were in agreement at the end of the day. There were some differences here and there, but perhaps upon further reflection, there's a different evaluation. Let's start with you, Dr. Andani. Post debate review. What are some of your thoughts?
Wait, one second.
Sure.
I just want to point out you might hear me typing here for a second. I realized I forgot to tell everyone that we're over here, so I'm going to be
no problem.
I'm going to
No
be typing.
problem at all.
Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, let's start with you, Dr. Andani. Has anything changed, or you still kind of have the same perspective?
well, I was quite happy with the conversation. I thought it was very free flowing. I thought it was very civil. I appreciated the ability to represent and give voice to a perspective on the issue that is fairly non-represented in Muslim Christian apologetics, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I was happy for Cameron to extend the invite and for David to participate. And I really don't have any complaints about it. I actually thought we made a lot of progress. Like we cleared a lot of stuff up, I thought. And I think what the discussion does is that it sets up some common platform for future discussions on related topics. And, when this was planned behind the scenes, I'm pretty sure David and myself, we both understood it was going to be a discussion or a dialogue, right? But, there are reasons to call it a debate, such as marketing. And, Cameron, of course, knows better on how to get eyes on his videos. And to be fair to Cameron, calling it a debate it makes somewhat sense, because we did want the people who watch these things in debate mode to hear what we had to say, right?
Yeah.
Because that's the only way you make progress. If you keep having the same argument for 15 years or 20 years, people over and over, it just gets old, right? So this dialogue that we had, I think it was an opportunity to hear some new perspectives, to also critically examine critiques of other perspectives and so on. So I was happy with it.
Yeah, I thought it was a very, very productive discussion because I was unfamiliar with Islamic positions that would say that he wasn't actually crucified. And so I think you argued that very, very well. And it will be interesting to see what, other Muslims have to say in response to that, perhaps those who would take the position that he was crucified. So, yeah, very well done. And Dr. Wood, your overall thoughts, post-debate review here?
Oh yeah, I thought we had a good, friendly discussion, and I think that a lot of what was said was new information for a lot of people, because in in Islam, I mean, in the Muslim world, you basically still have tons of people who support substitution theory, the theory that Jesus was replaced by someone else, and that Allah did this. But you also have this Zakir Naik Ahmed Deedat approach, where they're not defending substitution. Instead, they're arguing that according to the Bible, Jesus survived crucifixion. And it seems to work well with their crowd, with their crowd, who might not know that in the Bible it says a lot that Jesus died over and over and over again, and that you have Jesus himself saying he's going up to Jerusalem to die, and so actually claiming that according to the Bible, Jesus survived crucifixion. That may work with your crowd, but to everyone else, you sound like a deceiver. You sound like, are you serious? You sound like someone who's deliberately trying to deceive your audience and everyone else. And so it doesn't make a good impression. And so when Cameron was talking about a discussion with Khalil, I was mainly thinking, okay, he's an academic Muslim, and Muslims who are Western academics generally don't just throw out the crucifixion because that's a tradition in Islam. So I was thinking we'd get a different perspective from substitution theory, or from a force, or from the Zakir Naik approach. And it's interesting because I have seen lots of Muslims who got the point of what we were saying. And again, the main point is, if you just look at a passage, it does look like the verse is denying the crucifixion. If you sort of look at other passages in the Quran and let the Quran interpret the Quran, I can't say that any particular understanding is definitely the case, but there's definitely more options on the table than lots of Muslims are familiar with. So happy that they got that.
I'm fascinated by that position from Dr. Naik and others, that perhaps according to the Gospels itself, he was not crucified, or at least that he didn't die, I should say. When, as you know, there's so many passages that are explicit on this. I mean, Matthew talks about how he gave up the ghost and gave up the spirit. And so I'm just curious, how do they get around that? Do they just say, well, that part doesn't actually go back to the original Gospel of Matthew? Or
No, they stick with the Gospels. They go around and really cherry pick verses. They'll say things that are completely, and this is why it looks like it's actual deception, right? Because I don't go around and saying everyone who says something wrong is a liar. Most people who say things that are wrong tend to believe them, and so the question, is what's going on in the minds of Zakir Naik, people like Zakir Naik, and then Ahmed Deedat before him, and so they'll twist ideas in certain ways. Like they'll say, "Oh, Jesus showed his disciples that he had a body and he wasn't a ghost. Therefore, he was trying to show that he hadn't been raised from the dead." When even according to Islam, resurrection of the body, right? Your body gets raised. And so Jesus is trying to show them that he's not a ghost because he'd been resurrected. That's what he's doing. And that's very clear that that's what he's doing in the Bible. Namely, that if you saw someone die and then you see an appearance, people today still think, oh, it's a ghost. But if you want resurrection doesn't just mean life after death. It's raising up the body that died. And so Jesus is showing them that he's resurrected and not merely coming back as a ghost. And you had Zakir Naik and Ahmed Deedat say, you see, he's got a body. This means he didn't die because he's not a ghost. And so it's like, I see you laughing, right? That's what it sounds like. But to their audiences who don't know anything about, resurrection, some sort of appearance, they go for that. But they'll actually go for things like that. And lots of things are distorted, whether through ignorance or being deliberately distorted, but they'll just pick out little details. Sometimes you just have to like finish the verse or finish the passage to see how it's completely refuted what they've just said. But the main point that seems to stick in the heads of Muslims is that Jesus said you would be given the sign of Jonah. And so Zakir Naik and Ahmed Deedat, they say, what's the sign of Jonah? Well, was Jonah alive when he was in the fish, or did he die? And the crowd will yell, he was alive. And they say, okay, well then Jesus, when he was in the tomb, must have still been alive. And so they use that as their argument. When, I mean, it's been pointed out, one, I don't think that that's the exact comparison Jesus was making, that
Sure.
the state of Jonah inside the fish will be like my, state inside the heart of the earth. But it's a fairly popular position in Judaism that Jonah actually did die.
Right.
Yeah, he died and was raised, because he says he was in Sheol, and then he cries out from Sheol, and then God brings him back, and so on. So you can interpret that figuratively, and well, it's just things were so bad that I'm going to say I was in Sheol. But you can also interpret that literally, in which case it's someone rising from the dead. Anyway, the point is it's a pretty terrible position, and yet it's very popular because popular Muslim apologists say it, and their followers basically don't know that there are other options on the table. So that was kind of my interest in this discussion, is them realizing, wait a minute, just in the Quran, I can come up with probably some better positions than the ones that are being presented.
Yeah. And Lewis, I saw your hand was up there. I think you had something.
Yeah. Actually, the use of the swoon theory among Muslim apologists fascinates me, because for those who have done resurrection apologetics, we know what the swoon theory is. It started among secular atheistic critics of the Bible in the 19th century. And I've actually tried to track down at what point did the swoon theory started entering Muslim polemics towards Christianity. And the earliest that I could find was a 19th century Muslim modernist by the name of Chirag Ali, who was known for answering Christian critics of Islam and trying to modernize Islam. So from what I gather, he picked it up from reading modernist critics of the Bible. And since then, other Muslims have been following suit, taking the swoon theory from the secular critics and then basically putting an Islamic spin on it.
Yeah, I think actually before Chirag Ali, Sayyid Ahmed Khan, who's one of the forebears of, he's seen as like the father of Sunni modernism, Sunni Islamic modernism, Sayyid Ahmed Khan, he died in the late 1800s. And I think he actually, if my memory serves me right, I think it's on my slide as well, that Sayyid Ahmed Khan also believed in this, basically Jesus survived. Yeah, Jesus survived the crucifixion. So that we should, of course, remember that the swoon theory is not an invention of Muslim apologetics, right? As Lewis has said, there's a lot of sort of 20th century, 19th century historical theories that suppose or propose and hypothesize in various ways that Jesus survived the crucifixion. The most famous of these is Schonfield's book called The Passover Plot, which I believe was published in 1965. And there are others. Dale Allison, in his book on the resurrection, on page 11 and page 12 of that book, the book that he published in 2021, he has like a page-long footnote of modern era critical scholarship that proposed something like the swoon theory. Either he didn't die or he was resuscitated or something like that. So that's already there, independent of Muslim apologetics. And, just like, I wouldn't hold it against Muslim apologists to read all this literature and pick a theory from there. I think we all do that, right? We all sort of read the knowledge available in our time, and we try to come up with the best reading that we think is most consistent with other texts and so on. So I don't think the swoon theory is like, I don't think it's unreasonable. The problem with it is probably that it doesn't have, based on most historians, it doesn't have a lot of support behind it, right? To really argue for. Uh, but what's more fundamental, which is what my discussion with David was about, is what does the Quran actually say, right? Because if the Quran does not actually deny the death and crucifixion of Jesus, then there's no need to bring in swoon theories or substitution theories, because the motivator of certain Muslim scholars over the years and modern day apologists, the motivator for them to pull out substitution or swoon is they seem to think that the Quran is just outright denying the death and crucifixion of Jesus, which I don't think it is. There was one perspective I read. I should actually mention this earlier. So there's a website run by, I believe they're Ibadi Muslims, and it's called Prima Quran, and they've actually reviewed they reviewed my debate with Jake Brancatella last year, and they reviewed this dialogue between me and David, and they said something very interesting. And again, I haven't researched this perspective. They were basically saying that the actual like cross as a structure, if I read them correctly, something like Jesus was killed by the Romans, but it wasn't on like an actual cross. And that the Quranic word that we translate often as crucifixion in the Arabic, they were saying it really means impalement. And then they're also saying that in the Gospels, it's not very clear whether Jesus was impaled like on a stake in a sense, or whether he was put on a cross. So they had this alternative sort of view, but even then they said Jesus died, like, when he was executed, right? They were more, their gripe was about, well, the method of death. Was it a crucifixion or an impalement or something like that? And that's like a non-Sunni, non-Shi'i perspective, an Ibadi perspective. So I think the real thing is, what does the Quran actually say? And once we have argued that, or we've established that, then the theorizing and theologizing can come.
Yeah, David, any comments on that?
Oh yeah, I just wanted to add one because I always forget that there are people who might not be familiar with. I mean, there are always people, and everything's a new topic. So, just wanted to give a quick background on the swoon theory, because I actually think Muslims can have a better swoon theory than the skeptics of old used to have. So basically, for everyone who's new to some of this, swoon theory was one explanation of belief in Jesus' resurrection. And so the theory was Jesus is crucified, he passes out, and then the Romans don't know very much about when someone's dead or not. So they take him down, but then Jesus wakes up later in the tomb. He appears to his followers, and they think, he's been raised from the dead. And there are two just glaring massive problems with that. One is you have to not know pretty much anything about how Roman crucifixion actually works to think that someone's just going to, fall asleep and then wake up later. And the other main problem is that if someone actually went through what we know happened during Roman crucifixion and appeared to his followers, it would not have been, wow, he's the risen Lord of glory. He wouldn't have been able to walk. He would have been crawling around, hobbling. He would have been badly in need of medical attention. So that's why it was discarded. It was ridiculous to people who knew some things about this. But some of it is a minority view, but some Muslims who've held to the view, it's actually a stronger position, because now you're saying this random guy didn't just randomly survive a crucifixion. You have God actually miraculously sustaining him somehow. Mm-hmm. And so it does away with the problem that, you just don't survive Roman crucifixion. Well, obviously, if God is helping you survive Roman crucifixion, then you could actually survive Roman crucifixion. The problem, and it might seem like a reasonable sort of middle position between, if substitution and illusion were one option, and the other option is that Jesus was actually crucified, it can seem like a kind of middle position where, okay, we're acknowledging that Jesus was on the cross, so that wasn't a deception. It was Jesus. He was there. God just made him survive. So it's actually a stronger position than the naturalistic version. But yeah, so the main issue is that what the Quran is saying, and I don't think it is.
And if it is, I think your argument was that then creates problems for why God would allow this kind of deception when an entire religion was established based on this misunderstanding.
Well, that's more. I mean, you could still make the argument with like a theistic swoon theory that God is, by miraculously sustaining someone, and Jesus goes into a coma or something like that, tricking someone. But that's not nearly as much in the realm of just outright deception as substitution theory.
And Dr. Andani, I want to ask you just one follow-up question there before we get to Lewis and his questions. Did you have a response? I don't know if I don't think I heard it in the debate, so I want to hear it now if you have one. Did you have a response to the criticism that, well, if God allowed this misunderstanding that he was crucified and, an entire religion was created based off of this, then God is somehow complicit in that problem? Could you briefly address that?
Yeah, I mean, again, I don't believe in the substitution theory, right? So for me, I mean, God didn't deceive anybody,
Right.
right? So as far as I'm concerned, Jesus was crucified and he died on the cross, and the Quran is just responding to certain Jewish polemic that we find in the Talmud, because the Jewish polemic, where at some point Jewish scholars got fully on board the narrative, and they were like, "Yeah, we did crucify him. In fact, we put him on trial," which is what the Talmud is saying, and the Talmud is a bit unclear as well, which the Quran could also be criticizing, because in the Talmud we are told that Jesus was put on trial, and then his penalty was to be stoned, and then he was hung or crucified, right? It's a bit unclear, and even the time is unclear. Nevertheless, that's what it says in there. And as far as I'm concerned, the Quran is just responding to that. And that whole passage, as I argued in the so-called debate, is directed to certain, non-believing Jews, right?
Sure.
But the thing that I pushed back on is there are many good arguments against substitution, the pre-modern Muslim substitution theory, but I didn't think that God is a deceiver, therefore God is a deceiver was one of those. Only because a Christian in principle has to accept that God does send delusions or deceptions on people. I think I quoted a Bible passage that even said that, and that there would be nothing theologically problematic from that perspective, that if God has sufficient reasons to save Jesus from crucifixion by putting someone else there, God could be justified in that saving the life of Jesus, right, is a greater good than other people around him, even those who were with him, misunderstanding what happened, something like that. And I think, David, you said something very similar. You said something like, there may be reasons that God has for doing this. They're not obvious to us, right? They're obviously not apparent to us. So we can't logically rule that out.
And I know you don't take the position that he wasn't crucified, but do you think it's exegetically possible that the Quran does present that position? I know it's not your position, but is it possible that that is the case?
So in exegesis, in pure exegesis, if possibility is the yardstick, and many readings are possible. Right?
Okay.
Logically, linguistically, it's possible, right? But it's not necessary. The substitution thing is not necessary, but it's possible. The question is that we would have to line up all the possible exegeses of that and say holistically, using both history, right? Because people have to remember and that the Quran talks about this, the denial of the Jewish claim to kill and crucify Jesus. The Quran talks about this in Surah 4. Now, Surah 4 is revealed in the Medinan period. I think like the mid-Medinan period, if memory serves me correct. Before Surah 4 is revealed, you already have Surah 19, which is narrating the birth of Jesus, which mentions in passing that peace be upon me the day I die, right? That's in Surah 19. That's in the Meccan period. Then already Surah 3 is revealed before Surah 4, according to the traditional account. Surah 355 is where God tells Jesus, I will cause you to die. Inni mutawafika, right?
Mhm.
Everyone who heard Surah 4, what is the background information that they've already heard from the Quran? Right? What have they already heard about Jesus before they read Surah 4? They killed him not, nor crucified him. If we take that into account, right?
Mhm.
If we take that into account, then I think the probability of reading in a substitution legend goes way down, because you already been told God is taking Jesus and then raising him up. Like, you've already heard that. So then the crucifixion verse comes in and says, they, the Jewish enemies of Jesus, did not kill him. They did not crucify him, but rather Allah raised him to himself. And you've already read in a prior surah, heard it, that God caused Jesus to die and raised him to himself.
And that relates to one of the questions that I have. Is it the case that and how would you respond to one tafsir that says, whenever it speaks about, um, what seems to be his death in Quran 5, 117, could it maybe be referring to, he didn't actually die, he ascended to God, and he's going to come back, fight against the Antichrist, and then be put to death? D- Could you maybe comment on that interpretation?
Yeah, I mean, that is generally how it's read. There are two problems with it, right? So the first problem is in Surah 355, God says to Jesus, Inni mutawafika, verily I am the one who takes you. And firstly, that verb tawafa, all over the Quran, if you just put the Jesus linked conjugations aside, all over the Quran, tawafa in that form, right? Form 5, I believe. Tawafa refers to God or his angels taking the souls of those who die. Like,
Mhm.
that's how that verb is used. And you would have to argue that only when Jesus is linked to the verb, it's somehow an exception. So that's one problem, right? We'd
Okay.
be going against all the other mentions of the Quran. So anyone who, again, if you go back to the 7th century, you're hearing Surah 4 for the first time, or you're hearing Surah 3 for the first time, but before you heard Surah 3, you've heard, I don't know, dozens of mentions of tawafa, and you've understood it as God taking souls at death or his angels
Mhm.
taking souls at death. So then when you hear it in 355, the natural understanding would be God is taking Jesus, i.e., at death. But then right after that, right, in the same verse, Surah 355, after the taking, it says God is going to exalt Jesus,
Mhm. And so
right?
so the word basically doesn't include any kind of mediation, God taking one soul through the Antichrist.
No, no. I mean,
Okay.
it's always like God or the angels who, and the angels are mediators for
Got it.
taking souls, or the angel of death. But you don't see it used in any other sense. So it just becomes, I think it becomes a weak argument, and then you have to now bring in all this like storytelling from outside
Mhm.
the Quran to get the meaning that's sort of more popular today. I have to just step away, but you can
Sure, sure,
continue
no
with
problem,
it.
no
I'll
problem.
be back in a
Uh,
couple minutes.
Dr. Wood, did you have any follow-up, any interaction that you wanted to offer to that before we get to Lewis's questions?
Uh, yeah. So a couple of things. So on the and Khalil and I talked about this last time, that in principle I wouldn't have a problem with God, tricking someone or hardening someone's heart or something like that. Uh, if the God actually has a reason for that. But with the crucifixion, if that was all a an illusion from God, if God is taking one man, disguising him, making him look like another person, and that other person is being crucified in his place, and then the result of that, the consequences of that, are that you get the rise of Christianity, you get a rise of an entire religion built around this idea. Then it's like, well, what was the point? It doesn't seem like you just say, well, God rescued Jesus. I mean, God rescued Jesus already. It's already done. Jesus is safe. He's not in any sort of danger. So the fallouts could have been cleared up at some point by, hey, this didn't actually happen. Someone else was crucified. And yet the clarification doesn't come until, centuries later, and not even in a clear form in the Quran. It has to be cleared up through commentators who contradict each other on almost every detail of the story. And so it doesn't look, and none of them are getting this from Muhammad, to our knowledge. And so it's like, I don't know, seems like I don't put it outside of the realm of possibility, because as we talked about last time, God can always have reasons for stuff that we are not even aware of. But yeah, it seems like a pretty significant stretch. So the point there is, if I were a Muslim, I would be careful about the position to make sure that position is actually something that's required of me. That, hey, even if it doesn't make sense to me, that's what I have to stick to anyway. And so, but one of the points we're making is that's not the case. You don't actually have to adopt that position. And just to go along with what, just one point on what Khalil was just saying, Mutawafika in Surah 3, verse 55. I got two examples of feedback, one from a Muslim and one from a former Muslim. But the former Muslim who read that during a live stream very recently, I asked him, I said, hey, if you read this as a native Arab speaker, what do you think this means? And he said, if I were reading this, I would think that this is talking about him dying and being some sort of, somehow raised up or ascended or something like that. But he said, yes, that would be the totally normal reading would be to read Surah 3, verse 55 as Jesus dying. And then I was talking to a Muslim, and a very well-educated one, because he's familiar with all the commentaries and so on. And he was defending the Orthodox understanding of what the Quran is saying. But even when he was reading 355, because the word there is so associated with Allah taking your soul, that he said that this must refer to Allah making Jesus go to sleep, because there are Quran passages which talk about Allah taking your soul when you go to sleep, and then he can restore your soul, because you're not actually supposed to die that day. And so he was interpreting it as Allah taking his soul to make him go to sleep, to just go to sleep for a while. And so I was asking, why is he going to sleep? I mean, like, I understand Jesus is with his disciples and then Allah takes him away or something like this, or goes up through the roof of the house. You have commentaries that say things like that. But at what point is this, he falls over and takes a nap, if that's what the passage is saying? And he was just saying, I don't know, but that's what it has to mean. And so it's interesting that, as Khalil was pointing out, this word is so clearly used of Allah taking someone's soul, that when someone wants to reject the idea that it's taking away the soul in death, they're still stuck with, okay, must be taking the soul away in sleep or something like that, which ironically, that would fit better. That interpretation would fit better with the swoon theory, right? Because now Allah is taking your soul, you're passing out on the cross, and you can start getting a position that's more along the lines of Sheikh Imran Hussein. But yeah, so anyway, the point of all that is, you do have Quran passages where, if you were just reading it without trying to reconcile it with a particular understanding of Surah 4, verse 157, you would read these other passages and think that Jesus is dying just like any other person who's killed.
Yeah. Okay. Lewis, let's go ahead and shift gears. Lewis, I think you had some questions that you wanted to ask.
First, I do have one comment about what was previously said regarding, David's objection. If God made it seem that Jesus died on a cross, why didn't he inform the disciples of this fact? Interestingly, I've asked many Muslims over the years, and I've also looked at commentaries on 4157 on the question, were Jesus' disciples aware that Jesus didn't die on a cross? And interestingly, Muslims themselves are divided on that issue. There are some who say, yeah, the disciples were tricked along with the unbelievers, but that's okay. They could not be faulted for being taken in by the illusion. There's another viewpoint, and I tend to encounter this more among Muslim polemicists, especially the ones online. Oh, the original disciples of Jesus were aware of the truth. They knew that Jesus didn't actually die, but later down the road, they got supplanted by imposter apostles like Saint Paul, who um, did think that Jesus died and added that onto the disciples' message. So I think that the objection in question, yeah, I think it would work well with people who take the former view, whereas the latter would, they sort of have an escape hatch.
And but by the
In,
way, oh sorry, but by the way, there are, you do find all of these views in the commentaries. So you do
yes.
find versions of all these stories in the commentaries. So in fact,
Mhm.
you'll find commentaries where some of the disciples were gone and some of them were there, and so some of them knew about the just about what had happened and others didn't, and some would interpret 4157 as far as having no certain knowledge as referring to that the disciples didn't have any certain knowledge, and there was confusion there. But the point there, the point in all of that is, since we have no record of any of Jesus' followers thinking that he got tricked. You do have it as a later view, but we have no record of any first century followers, actual followers of Jesus
Right.
who thought that. And so, I mean, at that point, you could just, if you're just going to say, well, maybe there were some who held that. So the point is,
Mhm.
you can say something as pure speculation, but the only evidence we have to go on shows there Jesus' disciples
Mhm.
were out there laying down their lives for their claim that he had risen from the dead. And so I would say the burden of proof is on anyone else to say otherwise.
Yeah, I think the only way you can sustain that is if you think that the Basilidian Gnostics had the true message of Jesus, but their worldview is so far removed from anything, from so far removed from mainstream Islam that I don't think any knowledgeable Muslim would want to make that association.
Yeah,
Anyway, I
and
do
that
have a.
by the way is the real issue. Again, as far as people who are new to this topic, um, you have Gnostic and Docetist views that denied Jesus' death by crucifixion, that proposed a substitution theory where God made someone else look like Jesus and so on. We know where these stories came from. So when we hear the Islamic view, I'm talking to the Muslims out there, what it sounds like to us. When we hear this view being put forward by Muslims as the correct view of what the Quran is saying, it really looks to us like the Quran stole a view that is diametrically opposed in many ways to Islam, in which case it sounds like a huge mistake. So the real issue that Muslims should be concerned about when they're exploring this issue is, if the Docetist substitution theory somehow influenced the Quran, that looks like a problem for the Quran. But the Quran doesn't actually say that. That's an interpretation that's applied to the Quran. But if the Docetist influence came afterwards at the level of the commentators, then that wouldn't be a problem for the Quran at all. That would just mean there were later commentators who got it wrong. So, but this is an issue for Muslims to think about, as far as the way Islam, what it looks like to non-Muslims. That looks like, if you're saying that that's the view of the Quran, it looks like the Quran adopted a really, really weird view.
Yeah. Yeah, this actually ties into the question that I have lined up, which is how early exactly does the substitution theory go back? And it seems that one of the main strengths that that theory has going for it is that it does show up relatively early on in Islamic history. I believe in Todd Lawson in his book on this topic mentions Wahab bin Munabbi as the first real proponent of it, and I believe he was either the third or the fourth generation of Muslims. So within the third or fourth generation, you already had Muslims propounding this, and it enjoys near unanimity ever since, with only a few dissenters here and there. So maybe, I mean, I guess my question is, doesn't the popularity as well as the relative antiquity of this interpretation lend to its credence?
Either one
Yeah,
of us?
yeah. So
Yes, but for both, yeah.
Okay.
yeah, so I can go first. So yeah, Todd Lawson, what he does in his book is he catalogs the the purported sources of this, right? So we don't have like a book by Wahab ibn Munabi where he in his own words gives us the substitution theory. What we have is uh, classical period tafsir like Tabari, uh, or Muqatil, or somebody quoting people like Wahab or Ibn Abbas, right? So I mean, if we apply a proper historical method, it's difficult to say with certainty that Ibn Abbas or Wahab ibn Munabi or whoever taught this. I think with somebody like Ibn Ishaq, we're on much firmer ground because we actually have like Ibn Ishaq's writings, right? He left a his writings have been preserved in different recensions. So I would firstly say we don't know if Wahab ibn Munabi actually taught this, but let's say he did, right? Like let's just assume it. So yeah, he dies in the 730s, like the 700s, 730s or something, and he's in the early generation. Now, but here's the thing, right? Firstly, there's still a gap between the time of the Quran and the time of these storytellers like Wahab ibn Munabi. There's still a time gap there. And even if you think that the early generation's understanding should be privileged, and Salafis and Salafi-ish people think that, right? But remember, Shia Muslims have no commitment to just following the early generations. Shia Muslims would follow the succession of imams, and they would actually, not follow. They'd be opposed to like what all these other people may or may not be saying at a certain time. But the issue with the stories of substitution is, even if you want to take them seriously, they have no isnad to the actual event, right? So Wahab bin Munabi or whoever, Muqatil or Ibn Abbas, pseudo Ibn Abbas, they just narrate this story of they're in Jesus' house and he's like airlifted out of there. There's no isnad from this narrator to the events that are happening, 600 years before, right? So I would think that a Muslim who is traditional and who believes that everything needs to be backed up by an isnad, you're missing that critical component in the substitution theory. And furthermore, while many Muslims respect the early generations for Sunnis are not infallible. They can still be mistaken. And the fact remains that we do not have even a purported prophetic hadith where the prophet teaches the substitution theory. So there's really like no need to go all in on this. I would say even from a traditional perspective, and I think what has happened over time is there are many positions that just they become dogmatized over time in the tafsir tradition, and then there comes a lot of pressure on someone who dissents with that, and I think that's what happened here, and it's continuing in the modern day. Mufti Abu Layth, uh, he denied like I think the second coming of Jesus in a literal sense, and then like Yasser Qadhi, opposed that and said no, you have to believe in it, and so on. So these debates and these discussions continue. But again, I would say that if you judge what the stories say and what the stories claim to have happened based on traditional criteria, the stories as narrated about what happened 600 years ago in the time of Christ at that time, they lack the criteria. They don't meet the criteria that a traditional Muslim would need to believe in such a thing.
Yeah, David, any comments on that?
Uh, yeah, I pretty much agree with what Khalil said. One, um, there is more uh, adding names to uh, as attributions than lots of Muslims realize. In other words, if you had a theory and you wanted to add some credibility to the theory, you could always say, "Oh yeah, I got this from Wahhab or something like that." Um, and so, but notice even then, even if you grant tracing it back to Wahhab, this doesn't come from Muhammad, and it's in an environment where we know there were still remnants of Gnostic and Docetist ideas because the Emperor Justinian had like expelled heretics and so on, and you had them all over the place in the Middle East, and so it was very easy to pick up some strange ideas. The main issue, because it is a point to bring up that substitution theory has been a significant majority position for a very long time. But apart from the general idea, the commentaries contradict each other on so many details that you have this twofold issue. One, as Khalil pointed out, these aren't said to come from Muhammad. So these are later guys saying this. But two, since they're all over the place on the details and they disagree on the meaning of almost every single phrase in Surah 4, verse 157, it's clear that there's nothing they considered a dominant authoritative position. If there was a dominant authoritative position that they somehow knew went back to Muhammad himself or something like that, it seems like things would have consolidated around that view. Instead, they just seem to feel totally free putting together, oh, well, maybe this happened, maybe that happened, and maybe this happened, and maybe this happened. It was these disciples, and then this. Either the commentators themselves are making it up, or they're hearing it, and there are just lots of various stories circulating in the Muslim community. But I would have no idea how you would lay out all the theories and see that they don't come from Muhammad, and see that they contradict each other, and then just point to one and say, you see, that's the correct one. I have no idea how you would defend that Islamically. So that's one issue. But the other little side issue, which may or may not be terribly important, is that we our earliest record of substitution theory being the meaning of the Quran actually comes from John of Damascus, not from later Muslim commentators. And so there's a question, there's a mystery, because he doesn't say it. He doesn't say where he got it from. And so, was John of Damascus, who is criticizing Islam, was he reading Surah 4? Was he just sitting there reading the Quran, and he reads Surah 4, verse 157, and says, "Hey, what in the world is this? Is this what those Gnostics have been saying? Oh my goodness, what is this mess?" And then uses it to attack it. Or even worse, I don't think he was doing this, but let me trick everyone into thinking that the Quran is saying something really evil there, so that people are really repulsed by Islam as much as possible. But anyway, so there's a question of where John is getting this. Is he hearing this from Muslims, in which case Muslims were already saying it at that time? Or is that just his understanding of what the passage is saying? And then that leads to a further question, but again, we don't know. We don't know. These are just possibilities. When Muslims are defending substitution theory, is that kind of a reaction to John of Damascus? In other words, they did consider the positions of non-Muslims back then. Did John of Damascus actually influence the Muslims? Like, if you hear a critic saying, this is what your religion teaches, you might be inclined to say, oh, I need to defend that because it's being attacked. Or was it already understood? Just the point is, there's tons of room for disagreement, because we are missing so many details that we would need in order to firmly assent to one position over the other. We just don't have it. And so there's all kinds of room for trying to figure out what happened and proposing various theories. What I don't think, and I think this is, Khalil and I agree on this, what you don't get is, yes, it's just clearly substitution theory in the Quran, and that is the Islamic view.
Yeah, that actually ties into my next question, which is, the reason why the substitution theory has such tenacity in the Islamic tradition. And this is a little bit speculative on my part, but I wonder if perhaps it has something to do with the need among Muslims to deny the Christian doctrine of vicarious atonement. Like, obviously, you can deny vicarious atonement without denying Jesus' death on the cross, but I can see how maybe in the minds of most Muslims who hold to um, um, the non-realist view is to say, well, the easiest way to deny that Jesus died on the cross for your sins is to deny that Jesus died on the cross, period. Do you think that that might be one of the factors in play here?
Either one of us?
I
Yeah.
would not, I would not count that out. The thing is, I don't know the Christians in Arabia and in Iraq uh, and in Persia at this time. I don't know what their atonement theories were exactly, but we can assume that obviously the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus are essential to whatever theology they have. So I would not discount the fact that the need to counter Christian theological claims and dogma are motivating something like the substitution theory. I would not discount it, but I don't think we really have enough evidence to prove that this was the main motivator for the substitution theory. I think a much stronger factor, which I mentioned in the debate, is imagine you are a pro Umayyad or a pro Abbasid storyteller, right? So your understanding of success in the eyes of God is political victory. Your understanding of divine favor is winning for for God's prophets and representatives, God's prophets and caliphs. And the idea within a triumphalist theology that the righteous prophet of God can be defeated in a physical sense, right, or can be crucified or whatnot in a physical sense, it runs against the triumphalist theology promoted by the Umayyads and the Abbasids. So I think that is would have been more of a motivating factor of the crucifixion that we find, in these commentaries at the time.
Um, yeah, it's we talked last time. I had mentioned at some point that there are different people go through different periods in history, and sometimes people are um, emphasizing commonalities and agreement, and other times people are emphasizing the disagreements. And this is especially true if you're trying to kind of inoculate your group, your population from the views of another group. So there are times when it would have been in the best interest of a Muslim community and of a Christian community to emphasize the differences and say, hey, avoid that group. And so you can have something like the crucifixion as this sticking point, and people clinging to it for that reason. You do actually see similar things going on. So back in this has been pointed out by people who study uh, Jewish theology, but if you go back to the first century, it was actually fairly common for people to have views where there's some sort of plurality within the divine nature. You've got these two powers, like there's the Lord and the angel of the Lord, but the angel of the Lord actually speaks as the Lord. And sometimes there's the Lord doing this and the Lord doing that, and the Lord speaking to the Lord, and like, what's going on here? And so it was fairly common to have a view that there's some sort of plurality within the divine nature. As you have Christianity and Judaism at odds, the Jews veered away from that because it sounded to lots of people like something that could be used to support the Trinity, and the rabbis just started getting further and further away from that until there's no plurality within the divine nature. And so you can have that sort of thing where a view can become dominant and dissenting voices can be marginalized just because there's an ongoing dispute between two groups. And it's just a tendency in group dynamics. It's a tendency, and if you have two groups and they're at odds and they're criticizing each other, that they can push each other further away, because individuals within the group who are commenting and so on, you demonstrate your value to the group by criticizing the other group. And so there's a tendency to kind of, go further and further and further in rejecting what the group says. But again, there's lots of speculation here, because we just don't know what conversations are going on behind the scenes. We have a few documents to go on, and a bunch of later commentaries that are all over the place.
And just to add to that quickly, because the Shi'i Ismailis during the classical period affirmed the crucifixion, right? It's not unreasonable to suppose that the view that denies the crucifixion partly developed and spread among Sunni scholars, because there is a competition, both political and theological, between the Ismaili Fatimids and the emerging Sunni world, right? Sunnism, a lot of people don't know this, so it's important that your viewers know this. So what we call Sunni Islam or Sunnism as it exists today, with a consolidated understanding of history and law and theology, what we today call Sunnism did not exist when the Prophet Muhammad died. It did not exist 100 years after. It did not even exist 200 years after. Sunnism took at least 5 or 6 centuries to come together around some sort of agreement on law and theology. And it's not until really the 1100s and the 1200s that we get the Sunni consensus into a form that resembles what we know it as today. So before that period, before the 1100s and 1200s, Sunnism is still emerging. It's still being birthed. And during this period of its emergence, it is defining itself in opposition to Shiism, both Twelver and Ismaili. And if it was a well-known position that the Ismailis affirmed the crucifixion, you can expect that the Sunni position developed as the opposition to that, which means to deny the crucifixion. And that could explain why something like the substitution denial of the crucifixion had staying power. It was in polemical interests for Sunnis to hold to that view. If they started accepting the crucifixion, one could possibly be accused of being an Ismaili during that time.
Yeah, and by the way, along those lines, Khalil, I know you've seen this already. As soon as people find out that you're not denying that Jesus was crucified, they start calling you an Ahmadi, right? Like they're associating you with that, even though that's not your view, and you're not an Ahmadi. But there is this tendency, once you've associated particular positions with different groups, that any mention of that idea that group has, people start trying to put you into that category of that. And so this was obviously something that was going on in the past. And so it makes perfect sense that once you have an idea associated with a group, you don't want to be associated with that anymore if you're trying to set yourself against that group.
Mm-hmm. I will say this. I know that we've talked about substitution theory as mainly a Sunni idea, but I find it's actually popular even amongst Twelver Shi'is. I remember a while back I saw this Iranian film. I forget what it's called, but it looked very similar to The Passion of the Christ, where it was presented from an Islamic perspective, and because it's Iranian, it's specifically a Twelver Shi'i perspective. But they promoted the substitution theory in it. Like they even showed on screen one of Jesus' disciples magically transforming into a doppelganger of Jesus. So apparently they take that route in their understanding of 4157.
And that actually fits into what Khalil was saying, as far as So you've got what the Quran says, and then you've got the
Yeah.
issue of what does this mean? What is this saying?
Yeah.
And you have different interpretations. So he went on to explain why he thinks that position became so popular among
Mhm.
Sunnis. But notice, once you get away from from allegiance to Sunni commentators, you start getting other views, like ones that don't even deny the crucifixion. And so the question
Mhm.
is, well, the 12er Shias, they don't have allegiance to later Sunni commentators and so on. So why do they side with them? But I mean, there's actually a very good separate
Mhm.
reason for 12 or
Right.
Shias, namely that the idea of Allah rescuing
Mhm.
Jesus and he's got him in some safe place until he returns.
Right.
That's a pretty
That
good parallel with with
yeah.
the Imam who's going to return.
That's a good point. Although I will note this, the two earliest Shi'i commentaries that I've looked at, Al-Kumi and Al-Ayashi, I can't help but notice that when they get to 4157, they pass over it in silence. Like they say nothing about the verse at all. So it would appear that at what point substitution theory became popular among 12ers, it was after the time of those two commentators.
Yeah, the
Now, I
reason
do
for
have.
this could also be, in addition to what David said, um, it's been observed by modern scholars that after the occultation of the 12th Imam, what we call the 12er Shi'i tradition imbibes a lot of Sunni ideas in law, in theology, and in tafsir. So this could easily be one of these imports that the 12er tradition post occultation inhaled from Sunni interpretation, because we know many other Sunni ideas were sort of naturalized into the 12er tradition. So this could be one of them. You do have among Nusayris and Gnostic 12er Shia this idea, which is that, yeah, okay, Jesus, just as the Imams like Imam Hussein died in body, right? Jesus died in his body, but in his spirit, he didn't really die. And they sort of they give it like a Gnostic flavor, but it still affirms the physical crucifixion of Jesus. You do have some scattered 12er Shia who hold to that view as well.
Yeah. Oh, thank you for your insights. I do have some questions. I'll start with two for Dr. Andani, and then after that, I have a couple more for Dr. Wood. First of all, I want to dig into a comment that you made about how you view Jesus' death to be redemptive, but not atoning. And I want you to unpack what that means. Like, in your view, what is the difference between redemptive suffering and substitutionary atonement? Like, how can you have one and not the other?
Well, in my understanding, in substitutionary atonement, right, as I've heard and read about it from modern Christian thinkers, in substitutionary atonement, uh, humankind, because of either original sin or just because of sin in general, humankind uh, deserves divine punishment or divine wrath, right, for disobeying God. And in substitutionary atonement, Jesus, the Son of God, made into a flesh, who took on a human nature, Jesus voluntarily bears that punishment. He suffers the punishment that humankind as a whole deserves to suffer. So he suffers for human sin. And because in this view, Jesus came back from the dead, he has sort of conquered sin. He's redeemed humans from original sin. So he is the substitute in that sense. And again, I want to acknowledge that not all Christians, even today, accept substitutionary atonement. I think, though, it is the most popular theory in apologetics that I hear. But I know there are other theories, like there's ransom theory and there's Christus Victor. You guys could probably do a whole show on this, so I'll leave it at that. Now, the other theory of atonement, which I know some Christians still talk about and use today, but it's not very popular, is redemptive suffering. So in redemptive suffering, which is a type of redemption that you find in Islamic thought as well, the person, God's righteous prophet, or in the Shiism, God's just imam, these people come to earth with the divine mission and they fulfill that mission. But people, because people do bad things, people do injustice, people inflict injustice on Jesus or on God's just one. And the just one suffers literally due to, the bad actions and disobedience of the people toward him. So he suffers on account of other people's unrighteousness, not as a substitute, but he suffers as a consequence of people's actions. And the suffering has all this fanfare attached to it, whether it's a crucifixion or whether it's the killing, the massacre at Karbala. So what happens then is that the volume, the intensity of the suffering of God's righteous servant is so enormous that eventually people around that person, people who are there and people who live after him, they contemplate that suffering and it wakes them up. The enormity of the suffering jolts the people and it exposes their own unrighteousness to themselves, and it also reveals the righteousness of a person to them, and it triggers repentance on their part, right? So that's a redemptive suffering. So in redemptive suffering, then Jesus or the imams, they're not taking on a punishment in our place. They're suffering unjustly. So they are just, the people are unjust. And because of people's injustice, the just one of God suffers. And the suffering is so enormous that it wakes up everybody and triggers a spiritual renewal and repentance in the people who witness their suffering. That type of theology, I believe, and there's academic grounds for this, you can find it in parts of the New Testament. It's been argued. I think Bart Ehrman even argued this, not because he's a skeptic or anything, but as sort of literary reading of the Bible. Bart Ehrman has argued that Luke Acts, for example, does contain a redemptive suffering theology around Jesus' death. And so I think this idea is found in Judaism as well. So that's what I was talking about. And what I say, and I'm not the first person to say this, I'm trying to show how a Muslim can not only affirm the fiction of Jesus, but a Muslim can find that theologically meaningful. Because a lot of our discussions, they're very like zero-sum game. It's like either you accept the crucifixion and all the Christian theologizing, or you fully reject the crucifixion and you have to be Muslim now, or you have to be atheist. And I find that these lines are way too rigid, and there's a lot of room in between, and there's space that we can carve out to still make and affirm meaning.
Right. And besides the redemptive aspect, I know that in the Ismaili tradition, you also attach an esoteric significance to the cross, right? Could you maybe say a little bit about that as well?
I could go into great detail, but I try to summarize in a minute. So
All right.
in Ismaili thought and Ismaili philosophy, the religion symbols in multiple religions can be envisaged as symbols for metaphysical realities. And we would find this in every major prophetic revelation. So what Ismailis did is they looked at the cross, the four branches of the cross, and they said that, the four branches of the cross, they are a direct parallel to the four words of the Shahada, the first Shahada. So the first Shahada says, La ilaha illa Allah. That's four words. So the Ismailis assigned each word of the first Shahada to the branches of the cross. And then they also argued, and your audience may not know what I'm talking about, but they argued that the top branch of the cross represents the universal intellect, which is God's first creation. And then the side branch represents the universal soul, the second creation. The other side branch represents the prophet, and the bottom branch represents the imam. So the cross becomes a symbol for the hierarchy that God has created, which is God's guidance to the world. And similarly, the 4 words of the Shahada also represent that same hierarchy. So for Ismailis, it's actually only fitting that Jesus would be crucified, that the leader, the master of the age, who was Jesus himself, is symbolically attached to the divinely created cosmic hierarchy that represents the functioning of the divine economy world. And justice was physically attached to the cross. Muhammadu Rasulullah is verbally attached to the first Shahada, which corresponds to the Christian cross. And as Sijistani writes, that the cross something appropriate for the Christians, because the cross does have this inner symbolism, and you can sort of get the feeling of that when you read about the Passion narrative, and Jesus is literally carrying that cross like on his back, right? So from perspective, he's not just carrying a bunch of wood. Jesus, as the master of the time, he is the manifestation of this hierarchy of divinely created intermediaries. He is the universal intellect manifest on earth. So he carries that hierarchy in his soul, and he is its bearer during his time on earth. So that's how Ismailis would see the symbolism of the cross.
All right. That was very interesting. Thank you very much, Dr. Andani. I also wanted to ask you about something that came up during the discussion. It was when you guys were talking about salvation of non-Muslims in Islam, and you pointed to Surah 262, which talks about Jews and Christians attaining salvation. I've brought up this verse to a number of Muslims over the years, and the common interpretation that I've found among many of them is that they think that this verse only applies to Jews and Christians that lived before the time of Muhammad, and that it has since been abrogated. I take it that you don't agree with this interpretation, but how would you respond to it?
Sure. So I frankly, I believe that the claim that 262 is abrogated to be a complete cop out and a rather lazy way of dealing with the verse. Firstly, there's not even a consensus on whether it's abrogated or what it even means. So some say it does affirm the salvation of Jews and Christians and Sabians, but it's abrogated. Okay. But then another opinion is that it's only talking about Jews and Christians who lived before the time of the prophet, but the verse sort of expired in a sense, right? Another view is that this is just like an invitation to Jews and Christians to come and believe in the prophet, but it's not really saying what it says. Again, the abrogation thing, there are many arguments against why this could be abrogated. So one is that if this is abrogated, this verse is not about law. This verse is a divine promise. And even according to classical tafsir, promises of God are not abrogated. Abrogation only applies to matters of law, that is, matters of practice, ritual, fasting, where the Qibla is. Abrogation is a legal thing. It's a legal matter. But this verse is not about law. This verse is about a divine promise on who is saved. So to say it's abrogated is to commit a category error. Now, even if we were to somehow concede that 262 is abrogated, well, guess what? There's a near identical verse, Surah 5, verse 69. It says almost the same thing. And Surah 5, as according to and modern accounts, Surah 5 is the last chapter of the Quran to be sent down through Muhammad. So 569, which is one of the concluding sections of the Quran, reaffirms everything stated in 2. I find the abrogation argument to be very weak. As for the other reading, which says, oh, it only applies to Jews and Christians living before Muhammad, well, guess what? The verse doesn't say that. How do we know this? Well, the verse begins, both of them, Inna alladina amanu. Alladina amanu, or alladina amanu, those who have faith. That is always throughout the Quran a present tense phrase refer to those in the time of the Prophet Muhammad who believe and follow him. That's what Alladina Amanu always means. Although it has a past grammatical past tense to it, right? It is a present situation indicator throughout the Quran. So it's saying those who believe, i.e., in Muhammad, and then it says Jews, Sabians, Christians. It's clearly talking about Jews, Sabians, and Christians who exist alongside Alladina Amanu. Whereas if this is talking about Jews and Christians before Muhammad, then Alladina Amanu is like, it has no real meaning then in the verse, right? It's a meaningless term. So that other reading, in my opinion, doesn't make sense either. And notice how it says, though the one who believes in Allah and the last day, like that's the criteria for salvation in terms of belief. You have to believe in God and the last day. Well, the Quran in other places, Surah 3, verse 113, 114, 115, the Quran says that among the people of the book are those who believe in Allah and the last day. So some portion of the people of the book, and again, people of the book refers to people who are not followers of Muhammad. Some group of people of the book believe in Allah and the last day. And according to the Quran, those people can be saved. This language, there will be no fear for them, nor will they grieve. If you word search that language throughout the Quran, that's always a description of people in paradise. There's even there's more general verses, for example, that say believes in God last day, or whoever submits himself God last day, and then it says on them there will be no fear and no grief. So there's even a general verse, belief in God on the last day, as like the main criteria. The Quran is pluralist, exclusivist on truth. Okay, so the Quran is saying that the message it presents is the truth, and that these other communities, Jews, Christians, have made some errors. So the Quran will critique the theology of Christians, which is everybody knows. But when it comes to salvation, the Quran does not restrict salvation to those who follow the revelation of Prophet Muhammad.
Right. That's a good explanation. I do want to play devil's advocate a little while longer on this point, though. What do you say then to a Muslim who would say, bring up Surat Al-Bayyinah to you? Because in verse 1 of Surat Al-Bayyinah, it says, لَمْ يَكُنَ الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا مِنْ أَهْلِ الْكِتَابِ وَالْمُشْرِكِينَ مُنْفِكِينَ حَتَّى تَأْتِيهِمْ الْبَيِّنَةُ. So the disbelievers from the people of the book and the polytheists will not be abandoned until the clear proof comes to them. And then in verse 6, it actually says, Inna alladhina kafaru min ahl al-kitab wal mushrikin fi nar jahannam khalidin fiha. Ulaika hum shar bariya. So those who disbelieve among the people of the book will be in the fire of hell, abiding there forever. So that sounds like it's condemning the people of the book to perdition.
You bring that up because I think the first time, Lewis, that I met you at the Multi-Faith University of Toronto, when you were a Calvinist of some sort, I remember you opened up a Quran and you showed me this verse. And I'm going to give you the same answer today that I gave you in 2011. So it's the Arabic of the verse says, Alladhina kafaru min ahlal kitab. Min ahlal kitab. Those who disbelieve among the people of the book. It's not saying the people of the book are those who disbelieve. In fact, this translation, those who disbelieve, is even a bad translation. So kufr in the Quran is actually not about what you believe or what you don't believe. The Quranic concept of kufr is a very multifaceted notion which involves action, like fighting people, oppressing people, committing sin, a whole bunch of wrong actions as doing kufr. Okay, it's not about believing in Muhammad or not believing in Muhammad. And there's an article by I don't want to take up so much time, so I'll just refer people. There's an article by one professor at University of Michigan called "Infidel or Paganist: The Polysemy of Kafara in the Quran," published in the Journal of American Oriental the Journal of the American Oriental Society in 2020. It's a full analysis of this Quranic notion of kufr, of kafir, of kafara, of kafirun. And there's a very interesting argument he makes. Basically, it's only the Meccan theists who fight Muhammad who are actually called kafirun as a group. The people of the book as a group are not the same as al-kafirun. The people of the book are their own category. Now, among the people of the book, those who behave or act in a certain way, such as militarily opposing the prophet, a subgroup of people of the book are called alladhina kafaru, those who do kufr. Okay, but other subgroups of people of the book are called righteous, are called people who believe, who have faith in God in the last day. So the verse quoted is only describing alladhina kafaru min ahlal kitab, those who do kufr from among the people of the book. It's not talking about all of them. And if we go to Surah, and you're right, like in the rest of that, it says they're the worst of creatures, right? And I know everyone gets offended by this. Apostate prophet gets offended by this. How can the Quran call me the worst? What? We go to Surah 8, 55, 56, 57, 58. It's describing the worst of creatures, but it doesn't just say they're the worst of creatures, kufr. It goes on to say the worst creatures in the sight of God are those who reject him, will not believe, who whenever you make a treaty with them, they break it, for they have no fear of God. And then it goes on to talk about how they commit treachery and how they fight battles. So these people are given the category of kafir, or those who do kufr, alladhina kafaru. They're always a specific group of people who've committed certain misdeeds, which include breaking treaties, which include oppressing people. That's what makes them the worst of creatures. The Quran doesn't judge people's status merely on, what doctrine they believe in, not believe in.
All right. Yeah, actually, I do remember we had that conversation all those years ago. That's why I wanted to ask the question again so that you can repeat the answer, but in a public forum. We do have some questions for you from the audience, but I wanted to get to my questions to Dr. Wood first before we take those, if we have time later, Lord willing. My first question has to do with atonement theories in Christianity. A Muslim might object to Christianity on the grounds that, well, look, Christians can't even agree amongst themselves about what exactly the cross does. You have all these competing theories. You got penal substitution, you got satisfaction theory, Christus Victor, ransom theory. If Jesus died on the cross for my sins, then in one sense did he die on the cross for my sins? And why can't Christians get their theories straight? And related to that, which theory do you personally think makes the most sense?
Yeah, there are lots of issues. If a Muslim were to say to me, "Hey, you have differences of theology you have different theories that are meant to explain this, and that's a problem," my first inclination would be, if that's what you think is a problem, I can show you obviously a bunch of different Muslim theories on a bunch of important topics. So yeah, I think we do need to understand that when we're dealing with certain theological topics, one, we have limited knowledge, and two, we often have passages that support various theories. Like there's a reason that we have multiple theories of atonement in Christianity. You find passages that seem to support these different theories. So you can focus on Jesus saying, Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and to give his life as a ransom for many. And so you look, ransom, Jesus is a ransom. And then that leads to the further question, who's the ransom to? Is that to God? Is that to forces of evil? What's going on there? And then, obviously in the book in Romans 3 starts really, really sounding like substitutionary atonement and so on. So you have passages laid out that support various views. And so, generally what I find is when people are presented with these options, they'll just say, well, this one I think makes most sense to me based on the information I have, and therefore that's my position. And I just have never had, like, there are certain things where I will take a position on, and those are situations where, okay, I really, really see a good reason to accept this position, and I don't see any serious competitor. Therefore, that's my position. But generally, if it's a case where I look and I say, okay, I can see a Bible passage that supports this, I can see a Bible passage that supports that, I can see a Bible passage that supports that, and I can find really brilliant theologians who've held those different positions. And there are people now that I can look around at and see people that I respect as intellectuals on these issues hold these different positions. Usually in those situations, it's just in my head. I probably wouldn't want to take a position unless I really, really thoroughly investigate everything, so I can put my foot down on one position. And it's like William James talked about different kind of options, and he drew a distinction between forced options and avoidable options. And a forced option is where you have to make a decision. Like, I can either sit here or I can get up. I'm doing one of those. I'm doing one of those. There's no way of avoiding or putting off the decision. By not getting up, I'm choosing to sit here. So it's forced. If you have multiple theories, like if suppose you're talking about eschatology or something like that, David, what is it? Is it the pre-tribulation this or the post-tribulation this and so on? What's your choice? That's not a forced position. I can say I don't know. I can say in general, okay, I think Jesus wins. That's it. That's my position. I don't have to, there's no obligation to pick a specific theory. So that's one issue. The second issue is I tend to think in probabilities. So if you just say, David, there are 4 options, if I didn't know anything about those options and you said, what's the probability? I'd say, well, since I have no reason to favor one or over the other right now, because I have no information on them, I would probably assign a prior probability of 1/4, so 0.25 to each one of them, because I have nothing to go on. So that's the principle of indifference in probability. Then as you start getting information, like if you're talking about theories of atonement, then as you're reading Bible verses, they tend to start favoring one position over the other. And so now you can start seeing stronger and weaker positions. But even if you end up with a situation where it's like, 60% this and 20% this and 15% this and 5% this and so on, if I know I haven't really studied it, it's just in my mind, like, hey, maybe the 5% position, if I have more information, I actually study this thoroughly, might start looking better. And so anyway, long story short, I tend to think in probabilities and then not choose a position unless I really have to, or unless it's very clear. And so, and there are other factors that are involved here. So you take an issue like the free will debate. You have 3 main positions in free will. I'm talking about like given the physical world, do we have free will? And you got 3 main options. So you have hard determinism. That's where everything you do is determined by causes that preceded you, going all the way up and acting until now. But everything is determined, and it's inconsistent. The kind of determinism we have is inconsistent with you being morally responsible for your choices. In other words, you're not really responsible because you've been programmed to do everything you're going to do. So that's hard determinism. Then you have compatibilism or soft determinism. They're just as deterministic, but they believe that you can be determined to do everything you do and yet still be morally responsible for your actions. And then you have libertarianism, which is that you're not determined. There are other factors of you, whether it's a soul or whatever, and you're not completely determined, and you actually have the possibility, you have multiple possibilities open to you. You could do this or you can do that, and it's actually legitimate. Well, each one of those positions has a pretty strong case that can be made in its defense. And each one of those views has a pretty good argument against it. And so, in an ideal world, you'd say, okay, all the evidence points to this theory and refutes this other theory. That's just not how life actually works. You have theories where in this case, it looks like one of them has to be true, and yet they all have a problem, and yet they all have something to say for them. And so it's a situation where if I were just sitting back looking at the arguments for and against each position without taking anything else into account, I might be like, man, I can't make a call on this. It's too many things going on here. Whereas if you're a Christian, you have other commitments, then you can say, okay, well, this particular view, so let's say libertarianism, that fits better with Christianity than these other options. So I have an extra reason to favor one over the other. Anyway, long story short, theories of atonement. You see all of these in Scripture one way or another. I'm also not convinced that it has to be an either or in all of these situations. Like if I say, hey, Lewis, why did you do this? You can have a bunch of reasons for why you're doing something. And so I think there, at the end of the day, there might be a kind of combination of features that multiple views can all be correct. But yeah, it's a situation where if I felt compelled, hey, I have to take a stand on one of these issues, which I never had, that I'd probably study it thoroughly, probably go through the entire Bible, put the different theories on a piece of paper and start writing down, checking verses that fit one over the other, and then have to make a decision there. But I'm not in that position.
Right. I think it's a good point that some of those theories are not necessarily in opposition to each other because, personally, I think Christus Victor and satisfaction theory both have a lot going for them. So I would see both of them as valid. I think another good thing to note is that these theories tend to be tied to specific theological systems. Like satisfaction theory tends to be tied to Catholicism. Penal substitution tends to be tied to Reformed theology, governmental theory with Wesleyanism, and so on and so on. So it's almost like if you adopted one of these theological systems, by extension, you end up taking whatever theory of atonement is most held within that system, with some exceptions, of course. Anyway, I do have another question here. David, most of your arguments with Muslims in the past have been, with those who held to some form of non-realist interpretation of 4157, whether it's swoon theory or substitution theory. In your view, is it easier or harder to argue with and or share the Christian faith with a Muslim who accepts a realist interpretation of 4157?
Well, simply acknowledging the crucifixion, you're still pretty far away from Christianity. I mean, think about pretty much everyone, except for Muslims who hold to substitution theory or swoon theory. Pretty much everyone, atheist scholars, Jewish scholars, pretty much everyone agrees with us that Jesus died by crucifixion. So that's obviously not getting you very close to Christianity. There are a couple of interesting points, namely that if a Muslim comes to believe that Jesus died by crucifixion, you also have these passages where Allah raised him. And so is that actually talking about resurrection? In which case now you've got crucifixion and resurrection. And so it would be cool if those were not points of contention between between Muslims and Christians, if those are points of agreement. Because notice we have a lot of points of agreement, like virgin birth and Jesus miracles and so on. Jesus is the Messiah. It is, if that's not a disagreement among us, then it's, that's one less thing we have to disagree about. But, you're still a long way away from actual Christianity or the gospel, because it's the significance, it's the meaning of Jesus' death and resurrection that would then really be relevant. I would say there is a significant difference that can be had if you have a discussion with a Muslim about what the Quran is really saying about the crucifixion. Just because I've seen this, even since we had our discussion over on Cameron's channel, I've seen Muslims actually discussing this, And I've seen Muslims who said, wow, I never saw it like that. That's a really good point. And so it's actually good if people are somewhat skeptical of things they've heard. This is true for everyone, Christians, Muslims, atheists. It's good if people are a bit skeptical about what they were raised to believe, is their position. And so the kind of relevance here is, again, just believing in the crucifixion does not get you to Christianity. It doesn't get you much closer at all to Christianity. But if people start realizing, wait a minute, sometimes my text tells me I have to have a position, and other times I've just heard all my life that this is the correct position, and sometimes we don't distinguish between those, and it's just all what we believe. It's a mixture. So it can be good to sit back and say, I heard all my life that the Quran says this, but now that I'm reading it carefully, I'm not convinced that it says this. That can actually open up a person to, okay, well, maybe I really need to look at this stuff and form my own thoughts on this, to kind of distinguish from what I've just been raised all my life to think versus what I'm actually required to believe. And so as far as a Muslim believing in substitution theory, and then let's say he reads it in light of 355 and 817, these other passages, and concludes, actually, I don't think the Quran does deny the crucifixion of Jesus. I think the bigger relevance there is, now you've got a person who's actually critically thinking about these issues. And so that can be very helpful if you're a Christian and a Muslim and you're having a discussion and you're both trying to make sure you're right and not just going along with things that you've heard all your life, and actually trying to see where the evidence points and so on. I think that can be very helpful in discussions between Christians and Muslims.
Louis, I think there were some audience questions there.
Yeah. Actually, would you be able to pull up the questions?
Sure.
So, yeah, they're up in the chat box. So the first one was by Khalil Kassam, who's actually an in-person friend of mine from Toronto. He says he would love to hear both David and Khalil expand on their own theological understanding of the death and resurrection. And then Omar Yassin says, if I can request, can you ask the group for resources about abrogation?
All right. Maybe Dr. Andani first.
Sure. So, my understanding of the resurrection, very, very summatively, is that I believe, in accordance with the metaphysics and theology of Islamic philosophy, the Ismaili tradition, and Sufism, that Jesus died, physically speaking, and his physical body, I do not believe that came back to life. I believe that Jesus' soul transferred from his physical body to what Sufis and the Islamic philosophers called the imaginal body. In Arabic, this is known as the jism al-khayal, or the jism mithal. So Jesus inhabits a spiritual body or a celestial body after his death. In fact, we all, when we die, are transferred to our imaginal body. But the difference with Jesus and other great souls is that they are more in tune with the various powers of their imaginal body. And sometimes we even call this the body of resurrection in Islamic thought. So I believe in the resurrection in that sense, that Jesus inhabits a celestial body of the resurrection. And I believe that what the disciples of Jesus saw was a spiritual vision of Jesus in his imaginal body. Based on the metaphysics that I adhere to, and based on my reading of the New Testament from a critical historical lens, I think this is the best overall explanation for what happened. And you'll notice I'm not saying it's a hallucination or anything like that. And this idea that people can be seen in a non-physical but yet formal body after death is actually quite common. This is a very frequently reported phenomenon, especially people who lose a loved one, and even in other religious traditions. So that's my understanding. And there are even Ismaili sources that, from the 900s that say this. So Abu Hatim Arazi says, for example, that Jesus did appear to his disciples through the spiritual power of khayal, which means imagination, which again directly connects to the phenomenon of the imaginal body that I had just mentioned. So that's my understanding of the data. There was a question about abrogation. I can add to that too. So a good resource, by no means the only resource on abrogation, but John Burton, who is a Western scholar, has written a book all about Muslim legal theories of abrogation. So you can just type in John Burton abrogation on Google or Amazon Google Books, and you'll find it. There are some other titles, but I can't remember them currently. But abrogation is a very contested topic. I hear a lot of Christians sometimes speak as if like there's a consensus among Muslims on what abrogation is and what verses are abrogated and what are not abrogated. This is completely not true. If you just read the works of Muslim Quranic scholars, the number of verses in the Quran that have been abrogated by another verse range from like a handful to like hundreds. And there's just no agreement on this. So the whole theory of abrogation and the application of the theory, it's very, very contentious, highly speculative, and I would refrain from making any positive or negative arguments about Islam really has been abrogated, because you're going to find like the next guy is going to say, no, the verse is not abrogated. So it's more interesting to study historically. And the reason why Muslims came up with the abrogation is they were trying to interpret the Quran legalistically, right? And people don't know this, but the Quran, in the 23-year mission of Prophet Muhammad, the Quran was a dynamic, evolving, and responsive guidance. The Quran functioned closer to how Google Maps functions in your vehicle, where Google Maps gives you guidance at that very time and moment where you need to go based on current traffic conditions. And when traffic conditions change, the Google map will reroute you and send you on different directions to arrive at the same place. The Quran functions very much like Google Maps in that sense. It was an oral, dynamic, evolving revelation. It did not give or deliver a fixed body of law. The Quran changes Islamic law. It even changes how prayer and fasting are performed at least 2 or 3 times in a span of few years. So abrogation was then a later theory that Muslim scholars come up with once the Quran has been written down as a book, and they're trying to figure out, well, what is the law, the overarching law that we're supposed to go by today? So they had to come and say, well, these verses abrogate these other verses so they can square the whole thing. That's where the whole notion comes from.
Dr. Wood, did you have a follow-up for that? Any interaction?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, you can obviously get books on abrogation and so on. You can also, one thing you could do is, I mean, the relevant Quran verses, the main relevant Quran verses that actually speak about abrogation. That's Surah 2, verse 106, and Surah 16, verse 101. One thing you can do is just look up Islamic commentaries. You can go to Ibn Kathir online, or you go to altafsir.com, which gives you, Ibn Abbas and Tafsir Jalalain and so on. And so one thing you could do is, one easy step that anyone with a laptop can do is you can look up the verses and then look up commentaries. Just keep in mind, you're getting that commentator's theory on abrogation, but you'll start getting a sense of how various people are interpreting abrogation, and then some of the commentaries like Jalalain throughout Tafsir Jalalain is saying this verse was abrogated after this verse came along, and so on. But yeah, it is a pretty difficult topic. On the issue of Jesus' death and resurrection, yeah, we kind of already discussed a bit of that as far as specific theories of atonement. But as I mentioned, you've got the idea of ransom there in the Bible. You've got the idea of penal substitution in Romans 3. So you have these ideas, and in my head, it's combined with a couple of other ideas. Like you have fulfilled prophecies and so on. And then Khalil and I briefly talked in our last discussion that in my mind it's tied a lot to the story of Abraham's sacrifice of Isaac, in that you have all of a sudden God, who had made all these promises about Abraham's offspring Isaac, then tells him to sacrifice his son, and then he stops it. But for a brief time, God starts sounding exactly like the pagan gods of old, who demanded, you to sacrifice your children to him as the supreme act of your devotion, because your child is like the most precious thing to you. And so to sacrifice that, especially as in the case of Isaac, where you're talking about what's called the son of promise, there's all these promises associated with him. And then you have Abraham saying that God himself would provide a lamb for the offering. And then, of course, you have Jesus show up later, and John the Baptist says, "Behold, the Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world." But by the time you get to John 3:16, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten son, I read that in light of that entire story, where the idea of the ancient pagans was, you love your God so much that you sacrifice your son. You sacrifice your son to your God. That's the greatest thing you can bring to the altar. That shows your supreme devotion to your God. Whereas what you find it completely reversed and flipped. You don't sacrifice your son to show your devotion to God. God sacrifices his son, which is actually God incarnate, for you, showing you your devotion. And so you have these ideas all tied together. And then one additional thing, and I have to get going here as soon as we're done. One additional thing is it's sort of the solution to a mystery, in that if you look at Abraham, Hebrews says that Abraham reasoned that God could just raise Isaac from the dead. And the reason you have that is Abraham tells his servants, "Hey, we're going over here and we're coming back. So me and Isaac are leaving. Me and Isaac are coming back." It's like, what are you talking about? You said you're going to sacrifice Isaac. And so it's basically Abraham's in this position where God has made promises about this son. God is telling me to kill this son. Therefore, if both of these are correct, then God is going to raise him from the dead. And so you have a parallel issue in Old Testament prophecies, in that you have all of these passages that talk about the offspring of Abraham is going to be a blessing to all nations, and the Messiah is going to rule, and so on. But then you have all these passages that sound like they're saying, hey, someone's actually going to die. He's going to die for the transgressions of others, and he's going to be beaten and killed. And it's like you have these two parallel stories, and the common interpretation is these must be talking about two different people. These must be talking about two different people. One is this suffering servant, and the other is this blessing to all nations and this mighty king, and so on. These must be two different people. And so with Jesus' death and resurrection, you have the sort of Abrahamic solution to the problem, which is, wait a minute, if you've got this guy and he's going to do all these great things, and he's the ultimate son of promise, and he's going to die, well, then God's just going to raise him from the dead. And it's kind of bringing together these different lines of prophecy and so on. So anyway, I think Jesus' death and resurrection are doing all kinds of things.
Dr. Wood, thank you so much for coming on. I know you have to head out here in just a second, and Dr. Andani also had to head out, so I want to thank him for coming on. Louis, did you have any just quick questions that you wanted to ask there, wrapping it up?
Oh no, I think I covered all the ground that I wanted to. Once again, thank you for your time, and it's been a great pleasure.
All right, thanks, guys.
Thank you so much, Dr. Wood. Truly appreciate it. Everybody hit the like button and the subscribe button. And of course, check me out, patreon.com/reason and theology if you want access to extra patron exclusive content and you want to support what we're doing here. We'll see you later. God bless. Hey, thanks for watching. Don't forget to hit the like button and the subscribe button.